thanks for the nice introduction. Just that really make me blush. And I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. I know you guys all have very tight schedule, and it's really tough to get 1 hour to listen to somebody else, and then get 1 hour, spend 1 hour on lunch. So I really appreciate that. The Office of Research has spent a lot of time and effort organizing this event. I of course know that. Last Friday, they sent me a very long and detailed instruction what I should do, minute by minute. And I mean, nothing really out of the ordinary. So get a slide ready, or upload the slides, and make sure everything's fine. And the only thing that I was a little bit puzzled is to say they asked me to be presentable. Being a short guy, not handsome, I was spending about 2 days during the weekend. How can I make myself presentable? I'm not going to do a plastic surgery for this, right? And if I want to, it's too late. So I'm not going to ask them and say about this. So I asked them and say the dress code. What should I wear? A lot of my colleagues surprised me today, really surprised. Usually I wear shorts, running shoes, and a t-shirt, and they say, maybe I should wear a shirt, right? So just to make sure that I kind of respect this prophecy or the excellence of, anyway, the name is long. Okay, should I wear a jacket, or should I wear a tie? Or the answer is very short and sweet. Wearing a jacket, shirt, and tie. I'm thinking maybe I can wear shorts, right? I'm not going to embarrass myself. It's really my pleasure and to be honored my honor to be invited to present here. So the topic is corporate governance and the corporate reporting and disclosure. Because of the audience, so we have a lot of faculty members, we have students, and we have outsiders. So some of you are experts of corporate governance, and some probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about corporate governance. So I'm going to present a couple of papers. So initially I thought I would just present one paper in relatively detail, and then I thought, say, you spend 1 hour, I think your time should be better spent. So I'm decided to present 3 papers. Of course, I'm not going to discuss all 3 papers in great detail. These are the 3 papers I'm going to touch on. So the first one is the CEO contractual protection and the managerial short-termism. This is a joint project with my colleague, Xia, at SMU, and a couple of friends, one from Boston College, Elvis Low, and then Xin Wang from University of Hong Kong. So that's the first paper. And the second paper is managerial pay agreement and voluntary disclosure. This is a joint work with Jay Kim and Yang Jun Cho, and both are my colleagues at SMU. The last paper I'm going to discuss is internal governance and real earnings management. So that is co-authored with Jimmy Lee, my colleague here, and Terry Shevlin from UC Irvine. And I picked these 3 papers to make sure that I have the maximum number of participants, so that all my colleagues, which I'm affiliated, will be here. I don't want to have a really small audience. Like when I was in Wisconsin, I did a very similar talk in the end, so I got 10 people in the audience. Even Xia didn't show up. I was like, I'm not going to discuss the papers in detail, but if you are interested, so you are welcome to download the papers from the SSR website. So that is the key number you should remember. So put in your email account and say when you have a chance, when you have time, when you have difficulty sleeping, so click that website and you surely will fall asleep in no time. Okay, the common theme of all 3 papers is corporate governance. And they are just the different dimensions of a corporate governance. And I'm sure that you all understand why corporate governance is important. We have corporate governance is because there's an agency problem. And that agency problem coming from the separation of ownership and control. When the managers are not the owners, or the owners are not managing the daily operations of the company, and there's a concern whether the managers are going to do their best for the interest of the shareholders. And of course, the shareholders have to do something to make sure that their return is guaranteed. So that's basically the the root of corporate governance. And then people have spent many, many years, and of course the first one is Smith, 1776. So discussing the agency problem is basically say agency problem is it's unavoidable. You're going to have this problem. And then the question is, what can we do about this? And people have to have a look at the incentive alignment, have a look at the monitoring. And so here I define corporate governance as a system of incentive mechanism, organizational designs, and the legislation that is used to address this agency problem. By the way, this quote is kind of based on somebody else's definition. Don't quote me on that. I might get a problem. So that is the corporate governance issue we have. And people have a look at the incentive alignment. If the managers are not working for the best of the interest of the shareholders because, they don't think they can get returns from working hard, and one way to do that is you give them a stock-based compensation or you increase their ownership. So when they are the owners, they will behave like owners and they will work for the best interest of the owners. So that's the incentive alignment part. And then the monitoring. If we cannot incentivize them, so maybe we can watch them. So that's what I do with my kids. So I'm going to watch them once I'm home. So I watch them every minute until they're really tired of me. And of course the outcome is maybe they will behave better. Right? So we design that's basically the design of the board of directors. So how can we design the board, or what kind of people we should put on the board of directors to make sure that the board or the directors will monitor the CEO and make sure that the CEO is working for the interest of the owners. And ownership structure, and sometimes people suggest, okay, on one hand we should have a target ownership for the CEOs so that they behave with the owners, or sometimes we have a larger shareholder, family owners, so they will monitor the CEO more diligently. So that will also address the agency problem. And then gradually, I think especially in recent years, maybe the last decade, people spend more time studying the shareholder activism. Basically what kind of shareholders will monitor and discipline the managers. Will hedge fund managers do this, or we say large shareholders or block holders? People have spent more and more time on this. The last one is the legal enforcement. I mean, we can have all the structure in place and we have all this designed very nicely, but what if the CEO is still not doing what they're supposed to do, right? So if you put the incentive alignment there, so you give them a stock-based compensation, but they end up manipulating accounting numbers. What can you do, right? So there we have to rely on the legal enforcement. If they do that, they will pay the fine or they'll be put in the jail, right? So if the punishment is sufficiently high, and they're probably not going to do the bad thing. So that's the legal enforcement. So that's kind of the basic introduction of why we have corporate governance, what kind of dimensions of corporate governance we have. And people have spent many, many years studying this, and so it's probably one of the largest area in accounting, finance, and econ, and even the legal side. The agency problem we are particularly interested in all these papers is so-called managerial short-termism, or the myopic behavior. So people focusing on the thing that they can look at the next quarter or next year without thinking, what is the most beneficial thing for the company in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, right? So we all have different reasons why we focus on the short horizon. Like I say, we have KPIs every year. So whenever we have a strategy meeting or school meeting, the dean, which is not here, so we'll say, what is our KPI? Oh, she's in that case, I will move on to a different things like teaching evaluation. So as instructors, we care about teaching evaluation because teaching evaluation, if you get high teaching evaluation, you get teaching award, you will be loved by students, you will be perceived as the best teacher. So the question is, what should we do to improve the teaching evaluation, right? Should we spend more time and caring for the students and teach them the stuff we want them to learn, or should we make the materials easier? so that they will love us, and of course, in the end, they learn nothing from the class, right? So that is kind of the trade-off between the short-term gain, say having a high teaching valuation this term, and the long-term, say the sacrifice of the long-term values, which we want to, say, teach the students, which they can use the material or the knowledge for the next 10 years or 20 years, right? So that's kind of the short-termism we have. So that's the one of the drivers. So basically the job security concern. Another one is to increase the compensation, right? So I'm not going to use a school example now, from now on. Like for university, right? So the governance is a very big issue for basically any organization, right? So corporate, that's just one thing, and any non-profit organization or even government, right? So one key thing is when people are generally say, especially when you learn economics, so people work for their own interests, right? So compensation is one thing that the CEO will get from the job. So do they do something that sacrifice the value, the long-term value to increase their own compensation? Like say the example I just gave, say if we give them a lot of stock-based compensation to incentivize them, but say if the stock-based compensation, the options or stock are based on the current stock price, they're going to do something to increase the short-term stock price, which may not be reflecting all the fundamental value, right? So they do all those to increase their compensation. Well, and that's also the excessive focus on the stock price and takeover threat. So I think one of the Chinese companies recently get acquired after the short seller report. So I mean, when the stock price is say really, really low, and then other companies start to look at you and they're going to acquire you. And of course, that is not something that the CEO usually wants, because if the company is acquired, you basically outgo job. So that all those pressures kind of motivate the CEOs to be short horizon, and they're going to do something myopic, and that is something that the shareholders or long-term shareholders are not looking for. So that is the agency problem we look at in all those papers. So we basically refer them as a short-termism or myopic behavior. Okay. The dimensions that we look in all these papers basically is something that people have not spent a lot of time doing research about. So one is the CEO contractual protection. So basically say the employment agreement and the severance pay agreement. So I will discuss all those in a short while. And then one is the long-term incentive. Okay. So what kind of incentive that we can provide to the CEOs so that they can behave more like long-term shareholders, not the short-term shareholders. And the last one is the monitoring of subordinate executives. That people we have a very split opinion, very controversial, and some people think, oh, this idea is very intuitive, and some people just, this idea is absurd. So I will discuss that toward the end of the presentation. Let me know what you think. Oh, by the way, if you have any question, please let me know, and I would love to take the questions when we go. And the breaks I need actually for water, so please answer the question. And I will leave about 10 minutes toward the end for more questions on the broad issues which we are not going to touch on, we haven't touched on the papers. The first one is the employment agreement. I think of all faculty members, when you walk into SMU, you have an employment agreement. So basically the contract we have, say discussing what our responsibilities are and what is the pay structure and et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the CEOs have that employment agreements as well. Basically, a written agreement, very comprehensive, discussing the responsibilities, discussing the compensation, discussing the severance pay, and discuss what they should or cannot do after they leave the company. Like they cannot work for a competitor after they leave the company. Now, sometimes probably the president wish we have that kind of agreement so that we cannot work for our competitor, say NGS or NTU after we leave, right? So that will make the job really easier for the leaders of the university. And two key things. One is that it's a fixed term, 2 to 5 years. So that means within that period, the CEO cannot be fired, even if you know that the CEO has done a very lousy job. And that reminds me of the tenure system. In some sense, not tenure. So basically, no matter what you do, so in the system or the company cannot fire you, say, okay, you have done a lousy job. And if you really want to get rid of this person, and you have to pay the severance pay. So that is the protection the CEO gets. And a lot of companies, I will say 50% of the companies don't have this kind of agreements. Some companies say go out and say in their proxy statement, say we hire the CEO works for the company, and the company can remove the senior executive officer whenever it is the best interest of the company. So whenever they don't like this person, they will remove the person. There's no consideration for the term, no consideration of the severance pay. And that reminds me, in some sense, when I always use, what I know about, the school system to kind of draw the analogy. Think about the impact of this kind of employment agreement. When you think about it, you will think, oh, this might be entrenchment, right? You have this tenure system, and then a lot of people not producing, they're still here, right? So that's what the people call in the United States as dead rules, right? So you're not producing, but the system cannot remove you because of this protection. But then you have to think, what is the impact on people's incentive ex ante? If I don't have this kind of protection, what would I do? And imagine for the faculty members, imagine if you only have a 1-year contract, or you don't have any contract, you can be removed by the dean, removed by the president. And so the criteria or the KPI for you is to publish 1 paper every year, right? And then everybody will be stressed out, and that's not good for the health, right? And then everybody will think well, how can I publish a paper? Right? Sometimes I see this kind of distorted incentives in some countries, like where I used to live, China. Right? So you see the incentives distorted. I have a paper, I will just put my friend's name, right, on the paper. And they have the paper and they will keep the job. Right? But that is violating the integrity of this system. Right? And the benefit of this fixed contract is, so I'm thinking, what is the best interest of my development, and what is the best interest of the school, of the university. So I will spend more time developing or researching some big ideas, and which I hope to get some really nice outcome, right? So this long horizon, I can only get that long horizon from this protection. So that is essentially the impact of this employment agreement. And to a certain extent, that's also what the Severance Pay Agreement is about. And we have heard a lot of negative news about the severance pay. A lot of CEOs get really lavish payment after they've been fired, and many times because of the bad outcome or bad performance of the company. But at the same time, we have to recognize the benefit of the severance pay agreement. And the severance pay agreement basically says if the CEO is removed, is fired because of poor performance, or is removed because of a merger acquisition, and the CEO will receive severance pay as determined by the agreement. So think about, the takeover. If I'm a CEO of a company, I think, that some company is going to acquire me, I will do all the thing I can to make sure that the company is not taking over. Because once the company is taking over, I'm out of job, right? So I'll probably put a poison pill in the chart, right? So that is actually not the best interest of the shareholders of my company. So if I have a severance pay, I'm saying, okay, the company is acquired, but at least I get something out of it. So I will not do something bad to protect my job, to sacrifice the benefit of the shareholders. And the same thing with, the poor performance. Right? We want the company to innovate, we want the company to invest in long-term projects, but all long-term projects by definition are very risky. Some projects went out fine, and some projects are going to be a big failure. If I'm concerned by my poor performance, the board might remove me, I'm not going to risk my job for this long-term project. I'm going to do all the mediocre stuff and make sure the company is just running smoothly. Right? And that is not in the best interest of the shareholders. So this severance pay and the employment agreement basically protect the CEOs from those short-term performance fluctuation, and give them a longer horizon to think that what is the best interest of the company in the long run. So motivate them to invest in the long-term project. So that is basically what the employment agreements and the severance pay agreements can do, and give them the protection. But at the same time, all those protection can make people entrenched, right? So like the time example. So I'm entrenched, I cannot be removed, so I'm not going to work. So I spend all my time working in the gym, right? So as the dean said. So some people interpret what the dean said. So, right, and that is not good, right? So that's the entrenchment. And many times it's not the outcome that people entrenched because of the employment agreement or severance pay agreement. Sometimes, say the entrenched CEOs will negotiate with the company to get a better deal. Right? So give me a severance pay or give me really nice, say, contract, otherwise something will happen. Right? So these are the costs of employment agreements or severance pay agreement. So in the end, we don't know whether having employment agreement or severance pay agreement will help the company or not. So that is what empirical study is about. So that's what we do in this paper. So we went out to check to say whether these agreements help the company. And the setting we look at is to say, do companies sacrifice or cut the R&D investment just to meet the short-term earnings targets? Say for this year's target, say just to make sure that there's no decline in earnings. Are they going to cut R&D for that? If you know accounting, you know that to say all the R&D expenditures are expensed, no matter how much you spend on the R&D, especially the R part, the research part, right? Those are the expenses. So if I reduce the R&D part, so my net income will be higher because my expense will be lower. So that's the setting we look at to test whether employment agreements and severance pay agreements help the companies. So this is a very simple universal test. So look at the firms without the CEO protection, without any employment agreement, severance pay agreement. We look at the proportion of the companies that cut R&D. So we see 64% of the companies cut R&D when they feel the pressure from meeting last year's earnings. But for the firms with the employment agreement, CEO protection, only 47 cut R&D to meet the target. And that difference basically represents the benefit of having employment agreement or severance pay agreement. So when you look at the proportion, it's actually pretty high. The impact is very high, so 64% versus 47%. Of course, for any academic papers you have, that's the basic message. It takes about 2 minutes to get out, and it takes about 2 years to convince your colleagues they are actually robust. So we did a lot of stuff. So over the last couple of years, say we do, of course, do the multiple regression, and we're controlling for the endogeneity, which is very important, right? So when you think of why some companies have CEO protection, other firms don't have, there must be a reason. There are probably some firm characteristics that drive the design or drive the choice. So we control for that, and we also use other proxies for myopic behavior. So cut R&D to meet the last year's earnings is one of the proxies. So we use other proxies, and the results are robust. And also we find that in some cases the effect is stronger. In the cases where you expect the CEO protection is more important, say when the industry is more homogeneous, the company can easily remove the CEO because they can always get another candidate. And once the board's the governance is relatively weak. And we also find that there are no results in the cases where we do not expect the results. So when companies don't need to meet the last year target, they already have higher performance. So overall, the results are robust. So that's the first dimension of corporate governance, the employment agreement and the severance pay agreement. It's already 11:30, so if you don't ask a question, you will lose your opportunity. The second one is a longer pay duration. So here's basically coming from the use of a stock-based compensation. And of course, we all know the nice benefit of a stock-based compensation. You incentivize the executives and to make sure that they work for the benefit of the shareholders. But of course, it's also very risky. At least you have to pay them high compensation because they bear the risk, right? So the stock might go down, the options might become worthless, right? And also induce the managerial short-termism. So I have a paper on that, basically arguing that the CEOs, when they have a lot of options, a lot of stock, They're not going to think, say, what's going to happen to the company in 10 years' time, 5 years' time. They think, say, what is the price next quarter when I exercise options, when I sell my shares. That's what they care about. And that induces a lot of short-termism. And basically all the CEO or work counting scandals and largely driven by the use of option. And even Jensen, that's Michael Jensen, the famous Jensen-Macklin 1976 paper come out, say, at a meeting, and maybe I promote the stock-based compensation too much. So it's like drugs, heroin, get people high, and they don't think about, say, the long-term benefit of the company. And so what can we do? On one hand, we say, okay, we can reduce the stock-based compensation. If having too much options, too much stock, motivates the company to focus the short-term stock price, let's take away that, or say reduce the use of a stock-based compensation. And hopefully there will be, say, not so myopic. That's one solution. And of course, that solution, the problem is that when you take away the option, take away the stock, they're going to work, say, not for the benefit of the shareholders, right? So another one is to say, if our concern is, say, the CEOs behave more like myopic guys, and not for the long-term benefit of the shareholders, maybe we should link their compensation to the longer-term performance of the company. And let's not allow them to exercise their options, sell their stock next year, and let the vesting period to be 3 years. And that way they will care about the stock price next year. They will also care about the stock price in 3 years' time. If they cut R&D, of course, this year's income is higher and the stock price might go up, but say in 3 years' time, they will lose the competitive advantage. The stock price in 3 years' time will be lower. That will motivate them to work for the long-term incentive, long-term benefit of the company. That is basically the idea behind the pay division. And the question is, does it work? That's always, I mean, we can always come up with an argument to say, this works, this might not work, but in the end, we need to use the data to test whether it really works. So the setting we use here is disclosure. I mean, people have studied the benefit of this disclosure for many years, and so the disclosure is really nice because it reduces the cost of capital, because it reduces the information symmetry, and it enhance the monitoring of the manager. If we know more about the company and we can discipline the manager more or better. And it can improve the investment efficiency. If we know how the company is really doing, so we can decide whether to invest or say cut investment to some of the projects or even to the company. Right? In the end, it will increase the firm value. But of course, all these are the benefits to the shareholders. And if the manager's incentive are aligned with the shareholders, they can also enjoy the benefit. But at the same time, they bear the cost. If I know, say, what I have, the information I have, if I reveal that information to the school and the school can use that information to discipline me, I'm not going to reveal that information. So the CEO will hide that information. That is so-called the disclosure-related agency problem. And so we basically test, say, in this case, whether, say, given the CEO longer horizon, longer pay duration will induce them to think of the long term and induce them to disclose information. Right? So sometimes I say that to the kids, that's okay, tell me that you make some mistakes, right? So I will not punish you, at least not this time, right? So we can figure out what to do. Actually, you already don't do that. So that's the basic idea. So longer pay duration, say, reduce the myopic because it increases the managerial horizon. So I will not bother you with the detailed discussion. So this is what we find. So here we look at the likelihood and the frequency of management forecast. So that is our proxy for disclosure. And we look at, say, whether having longer pay duration will induce the disclosure by the CEO, by the managers. So we do find when the pay duration is longer, and the likelihood is higher, and the frequency is higher. Right? So that provides us the comfort, the evidence that to say, giving CEOs a longer vesting period, a longer horizon, and because it increases the pay duration, and they will be induced to disclose information. And what is really the thing that we really want is to say, do they disclose bad news? If they have a good news, of course. Right? So if I have a paper published, I will tell the dean right away, I get paper accepted, right? But I will not tell the dean every time when that paper gets rejected, right? So it is the bad news. That's why the dean never knows how many people get rejected. Many, right? So what we really want is to say, induce the CEO to disclose the bad news, because the bad news will help the shareholders to determine whether we should cut the investment or not, right? And also the long run. Right? So we know that having the short horizon will induce the managers to say, disclose the information in the short run. If they have something about this quarter, they will tell you, because they know that will affect the stock price right away, and hopefully the price will reflect. But then we want to know how the company is doing in 3 years' time, right? If I'm debating between Singtel and Mobile One, I want to know which company should I invest, right? I want to know what will happen in 3 years' time between these two companies, so that my investment will earn me some return. That is the long-term information we want. So the next two things we look at, I didn't have a table, so basically we find that the results are indeed stronger for the bad news than for the good news, and indeed stronger for the long-term forecast than for the short-term forecast. So they work in the direction or in the dimension that we hope they work for. If, say, the result turns out to be, say, longer prediction only induced managers to disclose more good news, that probably will not be so good. Again, we spent a lot of time, we're still working on the papers to make sure that the results are robust and stronger in the situation where we expect it to be important. Like, say, we identify some scenario where the disclosure is particularly important, say when the overall information environment is bad, and so there the value of disclosure is particularly important. Say, do we find a stronger result in that setting? And and then the result hold considering endogeneity. Endogeneity is everywhere. So I mean that's the favorite question people ask when you present a paper. So here, of course, endogeneity is a concern. So we spend some time and we're still thinking very hard on how to better address this issue. And we also find that managers with longer pay duration actually disclose more accurate information, more accurate forecasts. So they not only increase the quantity, but they also improve the quality of the forecast. So basically, say what we don't want is say they disclose a lot of biased forecasts. Say they know, say the managers, if they have a short horizon, they know they will sell the shares next quarter, and they probably provide some biased, optimistic biased forecast. We don't want that. And also with the longer pay duration, you hope that they will spend a little bit more time acquiring information so that the investors or the shareholders can say make better investment decision. So, and if the decision is based on some say imprecise information, of course the decision will not be good. So that's basically the reason behind the accuracy part. The last one is the internal governance. As I mentioned earlier, this is relatively controversial in the sense that whether the story is believable. What we have discussed, or what the literature has been focusing on, is more on the top-down governance. What can we do with the ownership structure? Should we have more, say, large shareholders? Should we have, say, family owners? And will those people help discipline and monitor the CEO? And should we have a better board? Should we have more independent directors? And of course, recently you probably see the Straits Times. Should we have more female executives on the board? So it believed that the females are better monitors than males, right? So a lot of discussion along those dimensions. So basically the top down. So what can we do? And even the punishment, right? So should the government do something, right? With the female director. So some people say, okay, maybe we should have a law. And some countries, I think it's Switzerland, actually require at least half of the directors should be female. Should Singapore have a similar regulation? So all those are top-down approach. What can we do from outside and from top to improve the government? And what has not been studied well is the bottom-up. Can the lower level employees, can say the middle level managers do something? And this kind of a design coming from, say, we discuss all the corporate governance problems. And you see that from academic papers, you see that from the press release articles, and everywhere. People say, the governance is broke, right? But surprisingly, a lot of the companies are actually running fine. Most of the organization doing fine. And then the question is, why? And people start to think, maybe we should also think about, say, the bottom-up monitoring. So do the middle level or say the subordinate executives exert some monitoring on the CEO. So that's what this paper is about, is focusing on. So we look at the executive, and the executives we look at are the top 5, except the CEO. So in the United States, so all the employees with the highest compensation will be disclosed, basically to know who got the highest pay. So there we get the list of the key subordinate executives. And the argument is, or the idea is actually relatively simple. When you think about the CEO, what do they care? Or say, what things can affect their welfare? So their own effort, right? So do they spend most of the time on the golf club, or do they spend most of the time in their office working for the company? And the subordinate executives' effort. Do all those subordinate executives work for the company? So get the company running and improve the performance is not just the CEO's job, right? So everybody is contributing. So that's the subordinate executives' effort. And of course, for CEO, and then you also have the private benefit. The private benefit can be, say, the use of a private jet or excessive compensation, nice office, etc., right? So that's what the CEO cares about, or what things affect the CEO's utility. So utility is kind of the down word for welfare. And then say for the subordinate executives, say what things affect their utility, their welfare. Say of course the CEO's effort. If the CEO is working hard, the company's performance improve, and everybody benefits. Right? So when SMU is doing well, and all the students, all the faculty will benefit from the rising reputation of that SMU, right? Subordinate executives' effort, their own effort. If say every faculty member is not working for the benefit of SMU's reputation will not improve, and we are not going to benefit. Right? So same thing for the company. Right? So their own effort, and then the longer term investment. So that's the key difference between the CEO's welfare and the subordinate executives' welfare. So the underlying assumption is the CEO is relatively older. They care about the welfare or the performance of the company in the next few years, and after that they will retire and they don't care about the company anymore. But the subordinate managers, they have inspiration to be the next CEO, and they have a longer term because they're going to work in the company for more years, and if something wrong, they'll probably be scapegoat, right, for all the failures. So the benefit from the long-term investment is higher for the subordinate executives than for the CEO. And then that gives you the conflict, potential conflict between the CEO and the subordinate managers. So the subordinate managers care about the long-term investment of the company. So that gives them incentive to make sure that the company is doing well and investing in the long-term project. So that by the time they become the CEO or they still work in the company, they can enjoy the benefit of the long-term investment made several years back. And the CEO may not be around to enjoy that benefit. Yes?
So, do you think that these top 5 executives, do they really represent the bottom-up employees?
Probably
some
not.
Some might say that CEO, CFO, CIO, they're sort of part of this exclusive club.
Exactly.
So how different the incentives are? Do these CEO, CFO, CIOs really represent sort of the bottom-up employees?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, that's one concern we have with the argument. Say, here we argue, say, subordinate managers have some incentive because they want to be the next CEO. They want to say they're going to be around longer, say they're going to enjoy the benefit of long term. Maybe the subordinate executives are as myopic as the CEO. They're just one group of executives. And many times, the subordinate executive is actually brought in by the CEO. When the CEO moves, and the CEO takes all his best buddies and executives along with him. Right? So then the question is, are they really different? They're probably as myopic as the CEO, or even worse. And they try to kill each other to get to the next post, right? So that's the concern, and we do have it. If that is the case, then of course we will not find anything. So that's actually one of the issues we have. And in terms of, say, the lower level employees, of course, we will really want to get the information about the lower level employees and to see how important to say their preference get reflected, but unfortunately we don't have the data. So that's kind of the limitation when you rely on the data already there and there's some limitation. Okay, so the next thing is to say, do they have ability to influence the CEO? So maybe the CEO cares about the subordinate executives' preference because they're nice, right? So I mean, we have seen a lot of nice bosses at SMU. So maybe some of the CEOs out there will be as nice, right? But of course, being nice is probably not sufficient. So another thing is to say, as just discussed, to say, for the CEO, subordinate executives' effort really important for their own welfare. If, say, they do something damaging the utility or the welfare of the subordinate managers, what will the subordinate managers do? So why I'm doing this? This thing only benefits the CEO, not for my own, right? So I'm not going to work. Okay, you probably cannot say just go to the CEO's office and say, I don't like what you do, I'm not going to work, right? And of course you send your resignation letter, right? So all people can pretend they're working and surfing, but they don't do anything, right? Contributing to the company. And also there's a difference, say, the authority, who really have the authority? The CEOs have the, say, authority from the organization structure, right? So they are the number one. But the subordinate executives have information. And when you ask the subordinate executive to do something, they will give you all the excuses. Oh, the market is weak, the supply is not good, so we're not going to do those kind of things. Those things give the subordinate executives some power so that they can influence. And of course, the CEO knows that. So the CEO has to take the subordinate executives' preference into consideration. Otherwise, they know that subordinate executives will not work hard, and that will reduce the welfare of the CEO. So that's basically where the ability, the power comes from. Yes?
So the second and third points, I think, are reasonable, but the first one sort of assumes the agency problem away. If the boss is nice, I mean, you just...
Oh no, that's actually a joke. I'm not thinking the boss is nice. So the key here, so the paper didn't say anything about it. So, I mean, all those argument or discussion basically does say the subordinate, if say we have some, say, subordinate executives, they have a relatively longer horizon, say they're younger, say more years until retirement, or they have ability. The ability comes from their contribution. If they're not contributing to the company's performance, the CEO will not care about them, right? And so those things will say that what we call, say, a stronger or more effective internal governance. And that internal governance will help reduce the problem. And of course, the counter arguments, ones say what Neil just mentioned, said the executives might be as myopic or even more myopic than the CEO. And if that's the case, our argument will not hold. And the second one is stability. A lot of people actually have more problem with this one. Say, many people say to us, say, imagine that you're not doing what your boss is asking you to do. Are you kidding me? You'll be fired in no time, right? So of course, we know from, say, some of the examples like Olympus, right? So the CEO was fired by the board, and you all know what happened to the company, right? So and recently, I think the UK court is going to pursue and sue the company for some of the damage. So it's not very good for the CEO to fire the subordinate manager when the subordinate manager did not do the bad thing the CEO wants the person to do. So remember, all these other bad things, say the cutting R&D. We know that this is a really nice project. We're not going to do it because it will reduce our performance this year. Or say, let's overproduce so that we will reduce the cost of goods sold. If you know accounting, you know that when you produce more, the cost of goods sold will be lower because you basically spread all the fixed costs among more units, right? But of course, when you overproduce and many of the inventories become obsolete, that's not good for the company. So when the CEO fires the subordinate manager for this kind of, not doing this kind of bad thing, I think that it will backfire. There are actually a lot of examples around that. Yes?
Just a question to clarify. How do you measure the importance of the subordinate executives to the firm?
Very good, thank you. So the horizon is, say, the number of years until retirement. It's a very simple proxy. In terms of, say, Kevin's question, how do we measure the importance, right? So of course, we don't observe the company. We don't know how important those executives are to the company. The measure we use is the compensation. So the argument is, say, if the executive is paid high compensation, right, probably because the company appreciates the effort, appreciates the contribution of the company, and also reflects the outside opportunity of the executive. Right? So we use the compensation of the executive to proxy to capture the contribution of the executive. And of course, we use the relative measure to make sure that everything is comparable once you go to the large sample. So that's the horizon, that's the importance. So that is basically the measure we use to capture the effectiveness of internal governance. And the proxy for the myopic behavior, basically what is the so-called real earnest management in the accounting literature. So basically you're cutting R&D, advertising, because those are discretionary. The CEO and the executive can decide how much we invest in this project. So they have discretion, they probably cut an R&D to meet earnest target. Or overproducing, as I just explained. Also excessive promotion to bump up the sales. So you give really, really huge discounts to entice people to buy your products. And of course the sales goes up and the earnings goes up in the end. So you sacrifice the cash flow. So those are the proxies we use to capture the myopic behavior in the real earnest management. This is the result. So this is one proxy of real earnest management. This is the second one. And this is the horizon, so the number of years until retirement for the executives. This is the pay ratio, basically the compensation of the subordinate executives relative to the CEO. We find that both variables, both proxies reduce the extent of real earnest management. So that means if you have a younger and relatively important subordinate executives, that helps the company because they care about the long-term benefit of the long-term performance of the organization. And of course, if we put these two things together and the so-called internal governance, we find the same result. So that means the stronger the internal governance, the better the performance. We haven't got down to the performance part yet. So the lower the extent of myopic behavior. So that's what we find here. So I'm not going to bother you with the battery of sensitivity test additional analysis. The paper is embarrassingly long. Actually, get an email from Terry Shevling. Maybe you guys should think about something to cut the math to 38 pages of a text. So 38 pages. Think about how much effort we spend. Anyway, so to conclude, so basically all the projects suggest that to say the managerial short-termism, which is a manifestation of the agency problem, and we can use, say, some of these organization designs, say the CEO contractual protection, give CEOs some employment agreement or severance pay agreement to, when I say talk to somebody in our school, some people say maybe I should get severance pay agreement. So that will help, definitely. And the longer pay duration, so if we're concerned about the CEOs with, say, the short horizon because the stock-based compensation is relatively short horizon, and so link their compensation to the longer-term performance of the company or longer-term stock price. Actually, I sometimes use Singtel as a case in my teaching. So Singtel actually has a very, very nice compensation design. So if you look at it, it's very complex, but they link the CEO's compensation to different dimensions of performance, some accounting performance, some stock performance, and different horizon. Sometimes this is 1 year, sometimes 3 years, and also different benchmarks, sometimes the industry competitors, and sometimes the overall broad market. So there are a lot of things that company can do to incentivize the CEO to think the long run of the company. And effective internal governance, so basically the message there is to hire younger people. So that's what we do at SME. Of course, a couple of caveats. So as with any corporate governance paper, so there's always a concern, say, there's no governance mechanism is panacea. So you cannot say, okay, if I do this, everything, all the problems will be solved. It's always tricky to think which one works, and sometimes some governance mechanism works in some contexts, but not in other contexts. Like even the pay duration, some people probably argue that you kind of induce the CEO to be too risk-taking. Another one is to say they should be taken as a system. We cannot say think each of these dimensions or the dimensions of governance I discussed earlier as an isolated mechanism that we can use. We have to think, say, all these potential mechanisms as a system to think how the system works and what is the best system for that individual company. So that's what I have. So any questions? Yes.
When I saw the term monitoring by subordinated executives, I was thinking of whistleblowing. To what extent do you think, or have you seen works being done on whistleblowing and the effect it has on governance?
There have been several papers on whistleblowing recently because, say, now in the US, you have the whistleblowing data set from the SEC. And many times the whistleblower's identity are unknown, and actually most of the cases, you don't know who is the whistleblower. And here we didn't consider whistleblower in the last paper because we think, say, all those key subordinate executives can serve as a whistleblower, but at the same time, by the time you whistleblower, you disclose the case, it's already too late. And we think ex ante, how the incentives, how the ability will affect the company's behavior. So that's the difference between our study and some of the whistleblower study. And we do see some cases, the top executives, not say, they serve as a whistleblower and also they provide the collaborating evidence to the SEC to kind of convict the boss. Yes.
You mentioned about all these packagings and all this the protection. I have a quick look at your data, the sample number. Actually, have a quite large number of the CEO now have the protection contracts.
Right. So if you combine both, say the employment agreement, the severance pay agreement, I believe it's 73%.
Yeah.
Roughly.
So and then another things that I understand whether you can get a protected contract is all depends on your bargaining power.
It is a negotiation, yes.
Yeah, it all depends on negotiation of the CEO themselves before the employment. And then, do you have a track of their track record? So like whether they have been a high flyer, have been successful. That's why they can actually negotiate for a longer period of contract, better terms. And then those that they could not manage to get it because they probably the younger one, they didn't have the track records. This will make a big difference. Okay, and also another thing is on the younger executive that you talk about, they have less earning management and all these. I mean the subordinate. Will it be to do with their experience?
Oh,
the younger one, they have actually not polished. Yeah, and then also the pay. You can look at the pay and the older one. Probably their pay drastically different. Then the incentive is different. Okay, so when they're more polished, then they are more in a position that they can gain more. They may be in a game.
Right. So the first question you raised is basically the so-called endogeneity issue. So say that some firms, say, or some CEOs, the firm characteristics, CEO characteristics drive the choice of the employment agreement or severance pay agreement. So that's something we control. So there we think are actually pretty good instruments. So basically there we look at the different states of the United States, and different states have different laws, and different laws kind of give the companies different reasons to use or not to use employment agreement or severance pay agreement. So that part I think we find. And in terms of the second one, say whether the younger CEO or the executives haven't learned the tricks or haven't learned how the importance of cooperating with the CEO, one thing we do is to look at, say, the combination, say the horizon of the subordinate executives and the horizon of the CEO to see, say, the thing we really want is to say the subordinate executives have a longer horizon and the CEO has short horizon. That's where we hope to find the strongest result. And say, given the horizon of the subordinate executives, say, even the subordinate executives still have a lower, say, longer horizon, but we change the CEO's horizon, what will happen? So we find indeed in the combination of subordinate executives horizon, longer horizon, and the CEO's short horizon, we found the strongest result. in terms of the pay ratio, so at one point we do look at the abnormal compensation in the sense, say, if we use the industry peer as benchmark, whether this subordinate executive is overpaid or underpaid, use that as a proxy for the power. And so that kind of addresses some of the issues you discussed, and we do find very similar results. Of course, we cannot completely rule out all the possibilities you mentioned, particularly related to the internal governance part. Basically, what the horizon captures, what the compensation captures.
Yeah,
and what we can do is say, change the dial. Say, okay, in some situations, say, we hope to find a stronger result. Some situation, we hope to find a weaker result, and that result is consistent with our argument, but not with the alternative argument. So if we find some of the so-called cross-sectional variation, and we are more confident about the results. That's actually the majority part of the paper is about.
Yeah, but I still don't understand the part about this. So the younger executive, how do you measure the longer, so-called longer objective or longer?
We basically use the number of years until retirement. So if I'm, say, 45, I have 20 more years to work for the company. I care about this company in the next 20 years. If I'm, say, 60, my horizon is 5 years. So as long as the company is doing well in the next 5 years, I don't care. That is also a lot of papers look at the CEO retirement. They do find when the CEO is close to retirement, they're more myopic. So after they gone, they don't care what happened to the company.
Talking about the younger one, of course, they have longer. Okay, but the problem is, how can we guarantee they will be there? We don't have the contract of these people, and also even their contract, high chance that actually these people may want to move around because, to be honest, a lot of times actually, a lot of company they may not necessarily promote internal people to become the CEO. Okay, and then
about
that's why
60% of
a lot
the
of
CEOs.
these, yeah. So you cannot expect the sample that you take, they all will be taken in the same company.
No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, what the empirical study can do is to look at the average result. And so, on average, the younger executives have a longer horizon compared to the subordinate executives with a short horizon. And so, in terms of say whether the CEOs are from inside or outside, I think inside promotion is about 60%, and the outside 40%. And also, that's why in many of the analysis we look at the combination of the horizon and the compensation. So by looking at the horizon itself or looking at the compensation itself, it doesn't give us the full picture. So we want the executives to have a longer horizon as well as important to the company. So it is that combination that helps the company. Yes.
So we see quite some adverse implication of this short-termism of the CEOs or managers. But then we still see in the reality there's a rich cross-section of the firms who still choose those, say, short pay duration or choose CEOs without those contractual protection. Right? That means, so the board may not necessarily even take into account those negative implication of those short-termism when they decide those contractual arrangement or the pay duration, or those implications may be not so important in their decision to choose those contract arrangement.
Exactly. So I mean, there are two possibilities. One is to say that every individual company makes the best choice in terms of the use of the employment agreement, severance pay agreement, and the horizon of the compensation, and that is one possibility. That is the equilibrium or optimal decision view of it. Another alternative is to say the board doesn't know much. And also we have to understand or remember, say, the board are working for the shareholder. Right, so you also have another layer of agency problem. Say the board of the directors may not work for the best interest of the shareholders. That's another potential issue. So I mean that potential issue leads to the possibility that it is off equilibrium in the sense the company is not doing the best for the company. Yes. I mean, a lot of researchers say focusing on the board, basically thinking, say, okay, maybe the directors, if they're insiders, they don't care. They care about their own benefit. If it's outsider, independent, they're actually not independent, or even they are independent, they don't have the expertise, etc. A lot of discussion. So I mean, of course, you get these two possibilities. So and our endogeneity discussion is addressing the first one. So whether it's optimal or not. And if we say inherit this off equilibrium situation, and then we see what is the difference. So if the company is say having a good structure, a good corporate governance, the company will perform as well. And if the company is not having good corporate governance, the company is not doing well. So that is the off equilibrium.
So you're fine with this inefficiency of the board?
I'm fine. I think I mean I don't think say a lot of the boards are efficient. When you really think about it. And many, of course, the companies are not doing well is because the change in economic situation. Many times because the company is just the company doesn't have good governance. Singapore, we're talking about a lot of as chips, so the Chinese companies listed in Singapore, I believe the majority of them don't have good governance. So they have a governance or something in place to protect their own benefit. So they are still rational. Rational in the sense they make sure everything is for their own benefit, but not for the other shareholders' benefit.
Since you have
Yes,
three
yes.
papers, so I presume so later you do a macro study between all the variables since it's going to be a system. The internal governance, for example, is always dependent on the perception of what the external governance structure is, which determines the incentive of the next level people to want to monitor their boss. If I see that the top level governance, external governance is citing their boss, they will go against their boss to say, right? So there must be a relationship between the two types of internal
That's,
governance.
in the paper, one of the analysis is look at, say, the relationship between the internal governance and we initially use external governance, but later on we call it other governance mechanism. What we do find is, say, the internal governance works better if the company has a better board. So you cannot say, if you just say, acting very passively, say the CEO is not doing something I like, so I'm giving up. And it's better if, say, there's somebody you can talk to. Say you have a strong board and you review your information, your desire, or say information to the board, and then the board can come back, discipline the CEO. So we do see a complementarity between the internal.
I wouldn't bet you if I know that your boss is citing you, right?
But in terms of a broader issue, so that's, I think, one of the referees actually mentioned. So, we're discussing all these different dimensions. I think the next step will be people looking at all the different dimensions at the same time. So as you notice, I'm working with a different group of people in each project, right? Different project. Next one.
Last question.
Yeah.
Internal governance, you are dealing only with the next level executive. But internal monitoring sometimes is done by those rank and file.
The rank and file.
Whistleblowing are from, I'm not at the bottom, but the supervisor and all those things,
Right.
they see more than other people.
Right.
So is there a way to find a surrogate?
Right, for the rank and file employees, so the whistleblower is more important because you don't have the channel to say review our information. So the only thing you can do is to say a whistleblower, either to the board. A lot of the cases, so they disclose the information to the board or to the regulator.
I said you are interested in the ex-ante thing,
Right.
So you could possibly use their pension schemes as a surrogate, as incentive to rank and file to monitor their bosses, because it affects their future and the future life.
Right, so that's actually how the discussion of the project started. So to think, say, to look at the pension or say the ownership stake of the lower level employees. Now later on we're concerned to say we don't think those rank and file employees will have any direct impact on the CEO. So if they're not happy, the only channel is probably to whistleblow. And so it's really hard to imagine, say, rank and file employees talk to the CEO and discussing something you haven't done right. We feel, say, the other top 5 executives, because they're all in the C-suite, or say they're relatively high level, they can discuss with the CEO, and the CEO will have to take into consideration of those people's opinion. So that's why in the end we move to the high level.
Because rank and file, you have to surrogate. Beside the pension plan, you have their extract with the unions
Right.
involved. Right? Both of them will provide incentives to monitor the CEO.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah, for the internal governance project, I have one comment. So I mean, some of the audience have brought up this issue about the younger people. They might not have necessarily have a longer horizon.
Right.
There's one index or variable available. Some people have looked at it, which is the employee satisfactory factor or index or something like that.
Okay.
So presumably, if those employees that they're relatively comfortable with the culture as
Right.
well as the company, they have longer commitment.
Right.
I'm not sure whether you can use that variable and they'll help you to tease out.
Yeah, well-
And when they're young, they also the firm employee satisfactory index is high, then that they have longer commitment to the firm and
Right,
better
right,
incentive. That's related to the lower or medium level employee, their incentive, executive incentive too.
Yeah,
There's a paper by Alex Adams at Wharton.
Okay.
He has a paper look at I think it's Fortune 500 firms employee satisfaction index.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely. Time's up. Okay, thank you for all your comments, and again, appreciate your being here.